This is Rain Stories. Today we're diving into the life of a ballerina in the 1920s, a world full of passion, hard work, and dreams that went beyond the stage. If you enjoy this story, feel free to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss an episode. Let's discover together what it really meant to dance through those changing times. In the 1920s, the life of a ballerina was a demanding, grueling, and often invisible journey, shaped by intense discipline, societal expectations, and a culture that romanticized beauty while overlooking the pain it took to produce it. A ballerina in this era did not live in the gilded fantasies presented on stage. Instead, her world was defined by strict routines, aching bodies, modest accommodations, and the constant push to balance art with survival. From a young age, girls who aspired to become ballerinas entered rigorous training programs, often in state-funded conservatories or private studios. These programs began as early as age 6 or 7 and continued into adolescence and adulthood, demanding full-time commitment. A typical day started before dawn. The dancer would wake up in cold, drafty apartments, often shared with family or other dancers, dress in hand-sewn leotards or repurposed garments, and head through foggy city streets to reach the studio before 8 a.m. Training was relentless. Classes began with barre work, pliés, tendus, relevés, done with repetitive precision to strengthen technique and condition the body. These early exercises could last for over an hour before moving to center work, allegro, and eventually point. Point shoes were neither cushioned nor forgiving. They were hardened with glue and paper, and most dancers had to darn and reuse them until they fell apart. Blisters, bloody toes, and swollen ankles were a daily part of the job. There was no medical support, no ice packs, only bandages, saltwater soaks, and endurance. Nutrition was rarely a concern for the institutions or companies they trained under, but it was a critical aspect of a ballerina's survival. Food was sparse and carefully monitored. In many households, meals consisted of stale bread, broth, or root vegetables. For dancers in the post-war years, rationing and poverty meant many trained on empty stomachs. A slender physique was mandatory, but dancers achieved it more from deprivation than calculated dieting. When a ballerina reached a certain technical level, she would audition for roles in theaters or companies. Most hoped for a contract with a reputable ballet troupe, such as the Ballet Russe or local state theaters, but competition was fierce, and favoritism, politics, and personal connections often played as much of a role as talent. Corps de ballet members, who made up the backdrop of performances, earned meager wages and worked under grueling schedules. Rehearsals could run for 8 to 10 hours a day, especially before a premiere, and injuries were ignored to keep up with the demands. Backstage, life was chaotic and utilitarian. Dressing rooms were small, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Costumes were reused, altered, and sometimes shared between dancers. There was little privacy. Mirrors lined the walls, but only a few had decent lighting. Dancers would hastily pin up their hair, adjust makeup with shared brushes, and wrap their aching feet in ribbons before stepping into the wings. Many smoked to suppress appetite or nerves. Some used opiates or tonics to dull pain or maintain energy during long performance runs. Romance was complicated. Many dancers were courted by wealthy patrons or pursued by fellow artists, but relationships were often transactional, and the power imbalance was significant. Some dancers became mistresses to benefactors to secure roles or housing, while others avoided romantic entanglements altogether, fearing distraction or scandal. The social life of a ballerina in the 1920s was limited. While some moved in bohemian or artistic circles, most spent their evenings recovering from rehearsals or preparing for the next performance. Sundays, if free, might be spent resting in bed or tending to mending clothes and point shoes. Friendships were formed quickly, but also frayed under competition. The theatre world was rife with rivalries, and jealousy often simmered beneath polished smiles. Despite the hardship, the stage offered moments of transcendence. For a few minutes under the lights, with the orchestra swelling and the audience rapt, a ballerina could become something divine. She lived for these moments, the fleeting sense of weightlessness, the heat of applause, the knowledge that she had moved something in someone. Critics often describe dancers in glowing, ethereal terms, never recognizing the bloodied ribbons and exhaustion behind the scenes. Fame, for those who achieved it, came at the cost of privacy and physical health. But most ballerinas remain nameless, performing night after night, fading into the background of the cultural elite's entertainment. In short, the life of a ballerina in the 1920s was one of silent strength. Behind the silk tutus and romantic pas de deux was a world of sweat, struggle, and sacrifice. They were artists, athletes, laborers, and survivors, living embodiments of beauty forged in pain and grace sustained through sheer will. While the challenges were universal, the experience of a ballerina in the 1920s varied depending on where she lived and worked. In Paris, ballet was interwoven with avant-garde culture, modernism, and a thriving café society. Dancers were often swept into artistic circles, where their work was seen not only as entertainment, but as a contribution to the evolution of art. Here, a ballerina might collaborate with painters like Picasso or composers like Satie. Though life was still hard, the intellectual and artistic stimulation offered unique opportunities for creative freedom. In contrast, ballerinas in St. Petersburg or Moscow operated within the more rigid framework of Imperial or post-revolutionary Russian ballet. The Russian tradition was steeped in classical rigor, upheld by institutions like the Mariinsky Theater and the Bolshoi Ballet. Dancers trained under strict discipline, often under government scrutiny. They were revered as cultural icons, but lived under immense pressure to preserve the traditions of Petipa, Ivanov, and other great masters. The political climate added tension. Following the Russian Revolution, art was expected to serve ideological goals. Dancers were state employees, and although they received housing and food rations, their freedom of expression was limited. In London, ballet was still emerging as a serious art form. Many British dancers trained under foreign masters or travelled abroad to gain credibility. The Ballet Russe, frequent tours to London, brought a new energy to the scene, influencing how ballet was perceived by the public. British ballerinas often felt like outsiders in their own culture, fighting to be taken seriously in a society that still viewed ballet as a novelty rather than a profession. In the United States, ballet was in its infancy. Few homegrown companies existed, and most aspiring dancers had to travel to Europe to find work. American ballerinas faced skepticism from audiences more interested in vaudeville, musical theater, or cinema. However, in cities like New York, interest in European art was growing. The seeds of future giants like the School of American Ballet had been planted, and dancers who endured the 1920s helped lay the groundwork for the boom of ballet in mid-century America. Each region had its own hardships and hopes. French ballerinas moved among intellectuals, but often lacked institutional support. Russians enjoyed state recognition, but were shackled by ideology. British dancers were caught between admiration for foreign talent and the struggle to define a native tradition. Americans were pioneers, carving out a place in a cultural landscape that barely understood their art. Yet across borders, the common threads remained: bruised feet, endless rehearsals, emotional resilience, and the pursuit of ephemeral perfection. Whether twirling under the grand chandeliers of Moscow, in the smoky salons of Paris, or on the modest stages of Boston, the ballerina's life was a quiet act of rebellion against limits, against pain, against invisibility. Public perception of ballerinas in the 1920s was a complex interplay between admiration and misconception. To the average theatre-goer, the ballerina was a vision of grace, aloof, elegant, and seemingly untouched by the mundane realities of the world. Audiences often saw them as part of a refined, almost aristocratic cultural elite, yet few knew of the economic instability and emotional strain these dancers faced. The press played a key role in shaping these perceptions. Dance criticism flourished in newspapers, especially in cultural capitals like Paris, London, and New York. Writers described performances in glowing prose, frequently likening ballerinas to swans, spirits, or angels. Their movement was said to defy gravity, their beauty otherworldly. But these reviews rarely ventured beyond the stage. The human being, the young woman who trained, endured, and suffered, was often invisible in journalistic depictions. Tabloids and gossip columns added another layer. Ballerinas who garnered public attention, especially those associated with high society men or avant-garde artists, were portrayed as both exotic and morally ambiguous. Rumors of affairs with patrons or scandals backstage became fodder for speculative writing, turning the ballerina into both muse and temptress. While this brought fame to a few, it also exposed them to harsh judgment, especially in conservative societies. Advertising also capitalized on the ballerina's mystique. Perfume brands, cigarette companies, and luxury fashion labels occasionally used dancers as symbols of refinement, draping them in silk or staging them mid-arabesque in print ads. Yet this commercial image was as airbrushed as it was misleading. These campaigns portrayed the ballerina as an embodiment of feminine delicacy and allure, obscuring the toughness, hunger, and emotional labor that defined her reality. Nevertheless, some dancers did engage with the media to shape their own narratives. Interviews in women's magazines or arts publications offered glimpses into their routines and sacrifices, though often these too were sanitized. They spoke of love for the craft, of tireless dedication, but rarely of the injuries, the loneliness, or the societal expectations they had to navigate. Public reception also differed by region. In Russia, where ballet was linked to national pride, ballerinas enjoyed a status akin to celebrities or heroes. In France, they were seen as artists, both revered and critiqued. In England, they battled stereotypes, often painted as fragile curiosities rather than serious performers. In America, the novelty of ballet meant ballerinas had to fight for recognition amid a sea of entertainment options. Here, Media coverage often focused more on their foreignness or appearance than on their technique. Ultimately, the ballerina of the 1920s existed in a dual world, celebrated on stage and misunderstood off it. She was both idolized and trivialized, her art lauded, but her personhood overlooked. The press helped to immortalize her beauty, but rarely acknowledged her struggle. And so she danced, between spotlights and shadows, between fame and anonymity, carving her identity in a society that saw her as an ideal, not an individual. The relationship between ballerinas and choreographers in the 1920s was often defined by power dynamics, creative intensity, and emotional complexity. Choreographers held the keys to a dancer's fate. They decided casting, shaped artistic direction, and wielded enormous influence over a ballerina's opportunities for advancement. For most dancers, especially those in the corps de ballet, the choreographer was not only an authority figure, but often an enigma, brilliant, temperamental, and unreachable. Rehearsals were spaces of artistic collaboration, but they were not democratic. Choreographers could be inspired, visionary creators, but also domineering, exacting, and sometimes cruel. They demanded absolute discipline and often pushed dancers to their physical and psychological limits in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal. Corrections were sharp. Praise was rare. Ballerinas, especially younger or less established ones, were expected to remain silent, absorb feedback without resistance, and execute instructions flawlessly. In elite companies like the Ballet Russe or the Imperial Ballet, choreographers such as George Balanchine, Leonid Massine, or Fyodor Lopukov were pioneering new forms of movement and narrative. Their work required dancers to constantly adapt, whether to avant-garde staging, unconventional scores, or abstract storytelling. This innovation created space for extraordinary artistic growth, but it also placed ballerinas under immense pressure to perform at the edge of their capabilities. A misstep could cost a role or an entire career. For many dancers, especially those from working-class backgrounds or who lacked strong patronage, aligning with the right choreographer was essential for survival. Personal rapport, compliance, and availability could determine whether a ballerina was cast in a lead role or left in the shadows. Some choreographers were notorious for having muses, specific dancers they favored and featured repeatedly. These relationships, though sometimes genuinely collaborative, were also fraught with imbalance. The muse often received special attention and creative input, but she was also under constant scrutiny and expectation. The gender dynamics of the time further complicated these interactions. Most choreographers were men. Most dancers were young women. The boundaries between mentorship, favoritism, and exploitation were often blurred. Some dancers experienced emotional or sexual manipulation, cloaked in the language of inspiration or artistry. Others navigated these spaces with strategic detachment, balancing ambition with self-protection. Still, many ballerinas found in their choreographers not oppressors, but partners in artistry. When mutual respect existed, the rehearsal studio became a place of shared vision and innovation. Certain choreographers championed the individuality of their dancers, tailoring roles to their strengths and encouraging interpretive freedom. In these rare instances, a ballerina could transcend the hierarchy and help shape the very language of dance. Regional differences also influence the nature of these relationships. In Soviet Russia, where ballet was state-controlled, choreographers were subject to ideological directives. This meant that ballerinas had little room to question artistic direction, as both dancer and choreographer were answerable to cultural authorities. In France, choreographers were part of the larger bohemian avant-garde. They might view ballerinas as co-creators, but also as tools in their artistic experiments. In Britain and the US, where ballet was still maturing, the smaller scale of companies often created more personal, if not always more equitable, working relationships. Despite the complexity, dancers learned to navigate these relationships with resilience and subtlety. They understood that a choreographer could open doors, shape reputations, and create roles that would define a career. But they also knew that behind every pas de deux was a negotiation of trust, power, and expectation. Ultimately, the relationship between ballerinas and choreographers in the 1920s was emblematic of the larger truths of the era. Beauty built on discipline, creativity constrained by structure, and artistry achieved through endurance. The best collaborations created performances that still echo through the history of dance. The worst left behind silence and scars. But all shaped the legacy of ballet and the women who carried it forward on their bruised and bleeding toes. The way ballerinas were seen in the 1920s was deeply entangled with the broader social status of women in a time of limited rights and rigid expectations. Although this was a decade marked by visible progress, women in many countries had just gained or were beginning to gain the right to vote, work outside the home, and engage in public life. The realm of professional art, including dance, remained shaped by patriarchal structures. Ballet was one of the few performing arts where women occupied the visual and performative center. Yet, paradoxically, this visibility did not equate to power or equality. Ballerinas were celebrated as artistic icons, yet they operated in a cultural framework that regarded women as delicate, ornamental, and emotionally fragile. These ideals were both reinforced and contradicted by ballet itself. On stage, the ballerina was ethereal, elegant, and disciplined, a living representation of grace and restraint. But off-stage, she lived within a society that limited her autonomy and often judged her ambitions harshly. A woman who pursued a demanding professional career, especially one involving the public display of her body, was admired only so long as she conformed to expectations of propriety, modesty, and femininity. While the 1920s heralded the emergence of the modern woman in Western culture, a figure defined by shorter hemlines, bobbed hair, and greater public visibility, ballerinas navigated a far more conservative domain. Even as women in broader society began to challenge traditional gender norms, the ballet world often clung to older ideals. Artistic directors, patrons, choreographers, and critics were predominantly male. They controlled the institutions and narratives, and their gaze defined the aesthetic values ballerinas were expected to embody. This meant that a ballerina's professional success was often contingent not only on her skill, but on her ability to fit a narrow image. Demure but seductive, obedient yet expressive, thin but strong, passive yet emotionally radiant. Her body was both her instrument and her currency. While her physical prowess required enormous strength, she was expected to conceal the effort behind a facade of effortless beauty. Outside the studio and theater, the social standing of a ballerina was ambiguous. She was not a housewife, nor a teacher, nor a respectable professional in the traditional sense. For conservative segments of society, especially in provincial cities or more traditional households, a woman who danced for a living was seen as morally suspect or socially unconventional. She occupied a space between entertainer and artist, and her independence could provoke admiration, suspicion, or even disdain. Marriage posed further complications. A ballerina's commitment to her art often clashed with societal expectations that a woman should marry young, raise children, and abandon personal ambitions. Many dancers delayed or avoided marriage altogether, not only because of the physical and time demands of ballet, but because they feared losing the autonomy they had carved out for themselves. Some married within the arts community, hoping for a more sympathetic partner. Others remained single, finding freedom in solitude, even if it came with financial and emotional risk. Within the dance companies themselves, the gender dynamic was also pronounced. Men, though fewer in number, were often paid more, received better roles, and faced less scrutiny over their personal lives. A male dancer who rose to the rank of choreographer or director had the potential to exert long-lasting influence over the art form. A female dancer, no matter how famous, typically saw her career decline sharply by her mid-30s, her value linked inexorably to youth and physical perfection. Still, the ballerina existed in a uniquely paradoxical position. In an age where many women struggled for public voice, she stood before crowds night after night, commanding attention and admiration. Her image was powerful, her talent undeniable, and her endurance a quiet act of defiance. Though she was rarely given authority, she embodied agency, moving through space with intention, telling stories without words, mastering her body against a world that sought to control it. In this sense, the ballerina of the 1920s was both a reflection of and a reaction to her time. She lived within the confines of societal expectations, yet her very presence on stage, strong, self-disciplined, and magnetic, challenged the idea that women belonged only in domestic or decorative roles. Through her movement, she claimed space. Through her silence, she spoke volumes. Financial hardship was an unrelenting reality for most ballerinas in the 1920s. Despite the glamour projected from the stage, the day-to-day existence of a dancer was often marked by economic insecurity and limited prospects for upward mobility. Ballet companies paid low wages, especially to corps de ballet members, whose contributions were essential but rarely rewarded proportionally. For many, dance was not a lucrative career, but a laborious, sometimes precarious means of survival. Unlike other performing arts where star power could translate into substantial earnings, ballet's hierarchical structure funneled wealth toward a handful of prima ballerinas and the management. Even leading dancers often received modest pay compared to their workload and public recognition. Those not in leading roles, apprentices, soloists, or ensemble dancers, frequently earned barely enough to cover rent, food, and basic necessities. Many supplemented their income with teaching, private lessons, or occasional work outside the theatre. Living conditions reflected this economic reality. Dancers often shared cramped apartments or dormitory-style housing with several colleagues, especially in large cities where rent was steep. Meals were simple, repetitive, and sometimes insufficient. A worn pair of point shoes was a monthly expense, as was the upkeep of costumes, makeup, and personal grooming. Any medical treatment for injuries or chronic pain was an additional, often unattainable cost. Financial hardship also influenced diet, which had direct consequences for performance and health. Dancers needed to maintain a slim, lean physique, but limited income made balanced nutrition difficult. Many survived on bread, tea, and whatever vegetables were affordable and available. Protein-rich foods, fresh fruit, and dairy were considered luxuries. Malnutrition and exhaustion were common, exacerbating injuries and slowing recovery. Class mobility through ballet was possible, but rare. For some women from working class or rural backgrounds, ballet offered a pathway to a different social world. The promise of regular pay, travel, and cultural engagement was alluring, and in certain cases, dancers used their careers to access educational opportunities, connect with influential patrons, or marry into higher social strata. However, these instances were exceptions rather than the rule. The rigid class distinctions of the era meant that most ballerinas remained within the lower or lower middle economic brackets despite their visibility. The artistic elite, choreographers, directors, and wealthy patrons often hailed from privileged backgrounds and maintained a distance from the dancers' lived realities. This divide reinforced a social hierarchy within the ballet world that mirrored wider societal inequalities. Moreover, the financial instability inherent to ballet meant that careers were short-lived. A dancer's peak years were limited by the physical demands of the profession, and without substantial savings or alternative skills, retirement often led to hardship. Some transitioned into teaching or choreography, but many faced uncertain futures with little social support. Widows, single mothers, or those injured on the job were particularly vulnerable. In this context, patronage played a complicated role. Wealthy individuals, industrialists, aristocrats, or artists sometimes provided financial support, housing, or gifts to favored ballerinas. While this assistance could alleviate immediate hardships, it often came with strings attached, reinforcing dependencies and power imbalances. A dancer's economic survival could hinge on personal relationships rather than professional merit alone. In regions with state-supported ballet companies, such as Soviet Russia, some financial stability was more assured. Dancers were salaried employees of the state, receiving housing and basic provisions. However, this security came at the cost of artistic freedom and ideological oversight, and salaries remained modest compared to the cost of living. The promise of social mobility was linked more to political conformity than to artistic achievement. In Western Europe and North America, where ballet companies were less institutionalized, the economic precarity was more pronounced. Dancers moved frequently between companies or cities, chasing contracts and roles. This nomadic lifestyle added emotional and financial strain. Constant uprooting, uncertain income, and the challenge of building support networks far from home. Despite these obstacles, many ballerinas accepted financial hardship as the price of their passion. The dream of performing on stage, of being part of something transcendent, outweighed the risks. For them, ballet was not just a job, but a calling. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay a daily struggle to make ends meet, to survive in a world where beauty was celebrated, but the body and the person was often forgotten. Touring was both a coveted opportunity and a severe hardship for ballerinas in the 1920s. To travel with a company was to glimpse the broader world beyond the city where a dancer trained and performed regularly, but it also meant surrendering to a relentless cycle of exhaustion, displacement, and physical strain. Touring was essential for career advancement, exposure, and financial gain, yet it exacted a heavy toll on the body and mind. The logistics of touring during this era were far from luxurious. Trains and ships were the primary modes of long-distance travel, both slow and taxing. Companies often traveled in large groups, sometimes numbering dozens, including dancers, musicians, stagehands, and management. The cramped, shared quarters on trains or ocean liners left little room for privacy or rest. Dancers slept on narrow bunks or in small cabins, with noise, motion, and constant movement disrupting sleep patterns. Performing in unfamiliar theaters added to the challenge. Stage sizes, flooring, and backstage conditions varied widely from city to city, often requiring dancers to adapt quickly. Some venues lacked proper sprung floors, increasing the risk of injury. Costumes and sets were transported with difficulty and sometimes damaged in transit, forcing quick repairs backstage with limited resources. Rehearsals often accompanied performances on tour. After long travel days, dancers would face additional hours of practice to adjust choreography to new spaces or to accommodate last-minute changes. The physical demands were relentless. A dancer's body, already strained from constant practice and performance, was subjected to additional fatigue from travel itself. Stiff muscles, dehydration, and irregular meals. Nutrition on tour was uncertain. Meals were often hastily arranged, depending on what local kitchens could provide or what was affordable. Familiar foods were scarce, and dietary restrictions, such as maintaining the slender physique demanded by ballet, were difficult to observe. Many dancers found themselves eating less, skipping meals, or resorting to quick snacks between rehearsals and performances. The emotional toll of touring was significant. Time away from family and familiar support networks bred loneliness and homesickness. The tight-knit camaraderie within companies helped alleviate this, but tensions and rivalries sometimes flared under the stress of constant close quarters and competitive pressure. Touring schedules were demanding and often unpredictable. Performances could be scheduled nightly or even multiple times a day during busy runs. Travel between cities might happen immediately after a late performance, leaving dancers with little time for rest. Missed trains, delays, or poor weather could disrupt plans, intensifying stress and uncertainty. In addition to the physical and emotional strains, touring exposed ballerinas to the pressures of representing their companies and, by extension, their countries or cultures in unfamiliar and sometimes unfriendly environments. Political tensions or cultural prejudices could affect reception, especially for Russian dancers touring Western Europe or American troops performing abroad. In some places, dancers faced discrimination or skepticism, adding psychological weight to their already heavy burdens. Despite these hardships, touring was also a source of pride and inspiration. It allowed dancers to see new places, meet different audiences, and experience the diversity of ballet traditions. Successful tours could elevate a ballerina's reputation and open doors to future contracts, collaborations, and even international fame. However, the glamorous image of touring ballet masked the relentless grind behind the scenes. The romantic ideal of performing under dazzling chandeliers in grand opera houses was often overshadowed by long train rides in crowded cars, freezing waiting rooms, and nights spent in unfamiliar hotels with thin walls and hard beds. The physical toll was compounded by the emotional strain of constant transition and uncertainty. For many dancers, the hope of eventual stability, whether through a permanent position with a prestigious company or a profitable solo career, drove them to endure these hardships. But for most, touring remained a challenging, exhausting chapter in a career defined by discipline, sacrifice, and the pursuit of fleeting moments of transcendence on stage. Backstage life in the 1920s ballet world was a world apart from the ethereal beauty presented on stage, a place where exhaustion, camaraderie, tension, and survival intertwined in the narrow corridors and cramped dressing rooms behind the curtains. It was in these hidden spaces that the real lives of ballerinas played out, far from the gaze of audiences and critics. The backstage environment was often chaotic and utilitarian. Dressing rooms were cramped and overcrowded, especially in larger theaters hosting international companies. Multiple dancers shared limited mirrors, sinks, and seating, all within rooms barely ventilated or heated. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, makeup, talcum powder, and damp costumes. Lighting was usually dim or harshly fluorescent, a stark contrast to the soft glow of the stage lights. Despite the physical discomfort, these spaces were where dancers prepared mentally and physically for their performances. The ritual of getting ready was a careful, hurried process. Hair was pinned tightly into buns, sometimes secured with wax or gel to withstand the strain of movement. Makeup was applied swiftly, heavy powder to mask stage lights, dark eyeliner to accentuate expressions visible from the farthest rows, and rouge for warmth. Costumes, often heavy with layers of tulle, silk, or velvet, were donned with the help of dressers or fellow dancers, each piece meticulously adjusted to avoid malfunction mid-performance. Backstage was also a site of community and solidarity. Amid competition and hierarchy, many dancers formed close friendships and support networks. The shared hardships, the injuries, long hours, hunger, and loneliness created bonds that transcended rivalry. Older dancers might mentor younger ones, offering advice on technique, managing pain, or navigating the politics of the company. These informal networks were crucial for emotional resilience. Yet backstage was not without tension. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, especially in companies where limited roles or favors from choreographers created friction. Gossip spread quickly in the confined spaces, fueling jealousy or alliances. The pressure to maintain appearances, both physical and social, was constant. Dancers were aware that backstage behavior could influence casting decisions, social standing, or even financial opportunities. The culture backstage was also marked by coping mechanisms. Many dancers smoked to calm nerves or suppress appetite, while others used alcohol or tonics, sometimes over the counter and sometimes more potent, to dull pain or anxiety. There was a tacit acceptance of these habits, seen as necessary to endure the demands of the profession. Yet, such dependencies could also lead to health problems or strained relationships within the company. Conversations backstage often revolved around shared concerns, upcoming performances, new choreography, injuries, or personal struggles. Dreams of advancement mingled with the reality of exhaustion. Dancers discussed everything from technique nuances to the latest rumors about patrons or management decisions. This mix of professional focus and personal gossip created a vibrant, if intense, social atmosphere. The backstage space was also a crucible for identity. Here, the ballerina was both vulnerable human and disciplined artist. She shed the glamorous persona required on stage and revealed the weariness, doubt, or determination hidden from audiences. Dressing rooms became places of transformation where the dancer prepared not just physically but emotionally to inhabit the demanding roles of mythic creatures, tragic heroines, or elegant swans. For many, backstage was a private world of refuge amid the public spectacle. It was where they could briefly rest, express frustration, share laughter, or find solace. The bonds forged there often lasted a lifetime, rooted in the shared understanding of ballet's harsh realities and rare joys. In sum, the backstage culture of the 1920s ballet world was a complex web of support and rivalry, survival and artistry, exhaustion and exhilaration. It was the hidden heartbeat of the ballet, where the beauty of performance was born out of sweat, whispered encouragements, and the relentless will to dance despite every obstacle. The social and romantic dynamics surrounding ballerinas in the 1920s were deeply entwined with the complex intersections of art, gender, class, and power. For dancers, personal relationships were often more than matters of the heart. They were tied to survival, status, and sometimes the very possibility of a career. In an era when women still struggled for legal and social equality, the lives of ballerinas were shaped by expectations and limitations imposed by a patriarchal society that both idealized and controlled female performers. Ballerinas frequently moved within social circles that included artists, composers, wealthy patrons, and aristocrats, men who held considerable influence over their careers. These relationships were fraught with imbalance. Many dancers relied on patrons not only for financial support, but also for access to coveted roles, housing, or even protection from gossip and scandal. The role of the patron was ambiguous. Some offered genuine mentorship and encouragement, while others exploited their position, expecting romantic or sexual favors in exchange. Such arrangements were often unspoken yet understood, a part of the backstage culture that dancers navigated carefully. While some ballerinas chose to engage with patrons willingly, viewing the relationship as a strategic alliance, others felt trapped, pressured to conform to expectations that compromised their autonomy. The stigma attached to these relationships was double-edged. On one hand, patronage could elevate a dancer's career and social standing. On the other, it exposed her to moral judgment and rumors, which could tarnish her reputation both on and off stage. Romantic relationships among dancers themselves were another complicated facet. The intense environment of rehearsals and performances fostered close bonds and sometimes passionate affairs. However, because ballet companies were tight-knit communities where competition for roles and favor was fierce, such relationships were often kept discreet to avoid gossip or accusations of favoritism. Friendships could be tested by jealousy, and alliances shifted quickly in response to changes in casting or company politics. Societal norms of the 1920s further complicated these dynamics. Women had only recently won the right to vote in many countries, and traditional views on femininity and morality still dominated. Ballerinas were often caught between the expectation to embody purity and grace on stage and the realities of their complex personal lives. The public and the press sometimes projected contradictory images onto them, as innocent muses or scandalous seductresses, adding pressure to maintain a carefully curated persona. Within this environment, many dancers sought emotional refuge in their friendships and confidences backstage, creating a network of support that was crucial for navigating both the physical and emotional demands of their profession. Yet the constant scrutiny, whether from patrons, colleagues, or the public, made privacy elusive. Letters and diaries from the era reveal a recurring theme: the desire for genuine connection amid the transactional nature of many relationships. Marriage and family life posed further challenges. For those ballerinas who wished to marry or have children, balancing personal aspirations with the demands of ballet was difficult. The physical toll of pregnancy and childbirth, combined with the need for continued training and performance, made motherhood a complicated choice. Many dancers delayed or forewent family life to preserve their careers, while others faced the harsh reality of having to leave the stage prematurely. In some cases, a successful romantic relationship with a patron or influential figure could secure a dancer's future beyond the stage, providing financial stability or opportunities in teaching and choreography. However, these outcomes were exceptions rather than the rule. The precariousness of a ballerina's career in the 1920s meant that few could rely solely on personal relationships to ensure long-term security. In essence, the social and romantic life of a ballerina in the 1920s was a delicate balancing act between personal desires, professional ambitions, and societal expectations. It was shaped by power dynamics that often placed dancers in vulnerable positions, yet also by resilience and agency as many negotiated their paths with intelligence and determination. Their stories reveal the complex humanity behind the sparkling performances, a reminder that beneath the glittering tutus were women navigating a world that demanded both grace and grit in equal measure. In the final reckoning, the life of a ballerina in the 1920s was far more than the fleeting moments of beauty and brilliance witnessed beneath the theatre's glittering chandeliers. It was a life of relentless dedication, marked by sacrifice and silent endurance. Behind every delicate arabesque or poised pirouette lay years of grueling labor, emotional complexity, and a constant negotiation with societal constraints that sought to define and confine the woman behind the art. Though the stage offered glimpses of transcendence, the reality was a world often shadowed by hardship, financial instability, physical pain, social scrutiny, and the precarious balance of personal and professional relationships. Yet, within this challenging terrain, ballerinas forged identities that combined strength and vulnerability, artistry and survival, grace and defiance. Their stories, often untold and obscured by the romantic myths of ballet, remind us that the dance was not just a spectacle, but a testament to human resilience. It was a rebellion against limits, a pursuit of perfection in an imperfect world, and an assertion of presence in societies still grappling with the role and rights of women. As we look back on the 1920s, the decade of jazz, flappers, and modernism, the ballerina's journey stands as a quiet, powerful counterpoint, a reminder that art is never detached from life, and that behind every moment of beauty lies a lifetime of struggle, hope, and relentless passion. And that's where our story ends for tonight. Now, Let the gentle rain carry you into a peaceful sleep. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and drift away. Good night and sweet dreams.